CPRE. We work to achieve a sustainable Sussex for everyone now and in the future. And as part of this work, we want to help communities with placemaking and getting the development that they want and protecting the countryside. So we have a sort of regular training programme for members, but also non-members. And today we're really delighted that Claire Tester from the Weald AONB unit is going to help us with some training. And we're a small charity. If you're not members of CPRE and you're interested in joining, then it's as little as £3 a month. The cost us to help more people to protect and promote the Sussex countryside. So visit our website if you would like to do that. I'm just going to quickly run through a bit of housekeeping because we've got over 170 people booked onto the training today, which is really fantastic. But in order that we can all enjoy it, there's just a few things that we need to bear in mind. The first thing I need to let you know is that we are recording this session. That's because some people were unable to attend. And we want to be able to provide this recording to more people so we can help more people. So if you don't want to be in the recording, then please turn off your camera, but otherwise the recording will be taking place. We're also asking if everyone can please remain on mute, because if everyone was talking, that would just get too noisy. You can ask questions throughout the session, and the way that we're doing that today is through the chat function. So if you look on your screen at the bottom, well, on my computer, there's a chat function, and you can send a question to Claire Lloyd, who will be collating all of the questions. And there will be 2 opportunities to ask questions after Claire's talk, and also after we hear from Phil Miles, who is a local resident. So I just want to say hello to Claire Lloyd. You can't see her because her camera's not working today, and introduce her. And also Leslie Wilson, who is a fantastic person who works for CPRE Sussex in our office and does all our admin and keeps everything running smoothly. So Claire and Leslie are going to be helping to make sure that everything runs smoothly today. So if you have a question at any time, just pop it into the chat function. So now I'm going to hand over to Michael Brown. So Michael Brown is one of our fantastic planning volunteers, and we have volunteers across Sussex who help people with planning issues wherever they can. So yeah, handing over to Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's indeed wonderful that we've got so many people participating today. This is the latest round of our series of CPRE training sessions, training that we've been running for 7 years now. That so many of you can be dragged out of the sun and the garden to attend our 2 short get-to-know planning presentations today is testament to the important role that the lie and use of the finite land resource around us plays in our lives, and the importance of our getting involved in the decisions that shape the use of our land to ensure that it offers us a sustainable long-term future for us, our kids and our communities, if that doesn't sound too pompous. We've got 2 sessions and 2 speakers today. Firstly, Claire Tester, the influential planning advisor to the Weald AONB unit. That unit exists in part to offer expert advice to the 15 local planning authorities which share responsibility for the conservation of the Weald and the restricted level of development that is allowed within it. Claire is a gamekeeper turned poacher, because in a prior life, Claire was head of planning at Mid-Sussex District Council, and as such, gamekeeper of the council's local plan. Many were the polite run-ins that I had with Claire over the years when she was in that role. From both sides of the fence, Claire has a wealth of experience to share with us on contributing to local council planning decisions, both within and without the Weald. Second up after a short break will be Phil Miles. Phil, a long-standing contributor to CPRE Sussex's work, lives in Horsted Canes, one of the High Weald's jewel villages. Phil's education in planning is more of the school of hard knocks variety, in that he and a group of local residents have successfully fought off not one but two separate developers who had the temerity to appeal, as I'm afraid that deep-pocketed developers nearly always do, against refusal of planning permissions to develop two different sites, greenfield sites, outside the village. Phil will share with you his tips on how to fight appeal battles and stay sane in the process. You're not going to learn all you need to know about planning today, but we will have achieved our aim if you leave today with greater confidence that we, the people, do have a voice, that we can be heard, and that we can make a difference. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Michael. I'm just going to attempt now to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Fantastic. Okay. So as Michael has said to you, now can't get it to work. Marvellous. Oh, better. So background to my experience, as Michael has intimated, I used to work for Mid Sussex District Council as their head of planning, and previously to that to a number of local authorities in Sussex and Hampshire. So most of my career has been in local government, if you like, on the other side of the desk. I've been a High Weald planning advisor for the last 5 years. But I'm also an independent planning consultant supporting communities, mainly producing neighbourhood plans, but also supporting CPRE in responding to applications outside of the AONB. And in the last year, I've also become a parish councillor. So I've got some experience now of responding to applications in my own village. So the presentation that I'm going to give today is drawing on that experience, really to help you respond to planning proposals in your area, whether they're in the form of planning applications or as proposed site allocations. I'm going to start by running through what information sources you can use to find out about a site and its surroundings, and then how to get your head around what is being proposed. I will then talk about how you use this information to make a persuasive submission. So the case history that I'll be using today is a small site on the edge of Ashurst Wood, which is just to the south of East Grinstead. And if you can see my cursor, the site is here outlined by my cursor. I'm starting to sound like a planning officer, ignore that. So several proposals have been put forward on this site, the latest of which was for 22 homes. All applications were in outline form, which just means that only the principle of development is to be decided. If you live locally to a site, you have an immediate advantage of knowing it better than the applicant and probably better than the planning officer as well. If you don't live locally to a site, or you just need to remind yourself of certain characteristics when you're writing your letter or email, then Google Street View is really helpful. It's helpful in reminding you of features. It's helpful in looking at different ways that you can view the site from public land. What you'll also need to look at is what sort of designations there are on a site. Different sites will have different policy designations, and that's going to be an important consideration for any planning proposals. You'll be able to find your local or relevant policies map on your council's website under the local plan or planning policy section. I'll talk about the policy references on this map later on, but for now, the point is that these maps can show things like where the AONB boundary is, where conservation area boundaries are, and such like. The other maps that are useful to look at is a website called Magic, which is owned by DEFRA. And there's layers on that map of different habitats. So in this one, you can see that this dark green area to the south of the site is priority habitat, deciduous woodland in this case. And it's also got other layers like listed buildings, archaeology areas, things like that, nature reserves. So it's a really useful resource to look at, and again, completely free. One of the things I find useful to look at is what historical information I can get hold of. This is because of, particularly in the High Weald AONB, the historic landscape is a really important feature. So if you can get evidence of what a site used to look like, either through aerial photographs or through historic maps, that can help you make the argument about what the character of the area is, what the historic landscape looked like, and why features are the way that they are now. Again, you can get this from free sources, so historic maps, National Library of Scotland holds maps for the whole UK, don't be fooled by the name. And Google Earth Pro is a really useful software, again, free to download, which has historical aerial photographs on it. If your site is within the AONB, then the AONB management plan will be a really important resource for you to look at. And there will be other site information available on our website as well about different site features, such as how old the fields are, historic field boundaries, historic routeways, that sort of thing. If your site's in the national park, and particularly South Downs National Park in this area, then it has its own local plan, which you will need to look at. It may be a bit confusing because the application may still be dealt with by one of the local authorities, such as Lewis or Chichester, because they delegate authority back to those local planning authorities. But they will still be considering that application against the National Park local plan. So that will be an important thing for you to look at. So planning policy is the most important consideration for any planning proposal. And it's worth familiarising yourselves with the ones that apply in your area. So the statutory development plan includes the local plan, which may be one document or it may be a collection of documents, and any neighbourhood plan. In some areas, or in some cases, it can also include a minerals or waste local plan. These documents all have to be in accordance with national planning policy, which is mainly contained within the National Planning Policy Framework. To see which policies apply in your area, the best starting point is those policy maps that I referred to earlier. And the one here shows which policies apply to which part of Ashurst Wood, and that includes not just the district plan policies in this case, but also the neighbourhood plan policies. And they should all be on the same map. But if you're aware that there's a recent document, a recent neighbourhood plan, for instance, that's been adopted, you may need to look at that separately. Planning policies are continuously being updated through reviews of local plans and neighbourhood plans, and they may be given less weight if they're considered to be out of date or out of step with national policy. And the most common reason for that is if a local authority doesn't have enough housing sites identified to meet targets, or they're not being delivered quickly enough. In all circumstances, don't assume that the location of a site outside a development boundary or in an AONB will be enough to prevent development. Other material considerations such as landscape impact, village character and street scene or biodiversity will be needed to justify any refusal of planning permission or the deletion of a proposed allocation. So how do you find out information about the application itself? All local planning authorities are required to keep a public register of planning applications, and these days that's done electronically with access via their websites. Various different software is used, but the one I've shown here on the screen is one of the most common pieces of software, and they all work in a similar way, even if they look superficially different. Even if you know the application number of a proposal, it's worth entering the address or the postcode into the search box down here, because that will bring up all of the applications on that site or around that site. And the planning history of a site is really important, because if a council has made a decision for a similar development on that site, then any future decision they make needs to be consistent with that. Some planning portals also give you the option of searching via a map, and that's particularly helpful if you're not sure what address the application might have been registered under. If, for instance, it's a field that's not close to any particular property, it's often easier to find it on a map than try and guess what name they would have given it. It can also show you what else has been permitted or applied for in the vicinity of the site. And there'll often be a filter on this screen so that you can decide what kind of time span you want to look over. And I would suggest you set that at 5 years so that you can see everything that might not have been implemented yet. So what are you actually looking for once you get into the application? And this is specifically for planning applications rather than site allocations. If you've got a relatively small application, for instance, your neighbour's applying for an extension, then you may only have an application form and 2 or 3 plans, so you can read everything. But if you're looking at a bigger proposal, there may be hundreds of documents, and it can be quite bewildering working out which ones are worth looking at and which ones aren't. I would always start with the application form because that says what kind of application it is. And I'd look at the location plan because that will define exactly where the site is and which land is part of that proposal. The next document I would go to is the planning statement, as this should pull together all the conclusions of any other supporting documents and will give a good overview of the proposal and the arguments that the applicant or the agent is making to justify it. If there's a separate design and access statement, I would then go to that because it should explain why a particular design has been chosen. And it also often has 3D colour illustrations within it, which are easier to visualise than the flat plans that are produced for the application itself. Which other documents you look at depends on what your particular interests and expertise are. As a landscape consultee, I would always look at the landscape and visual impact assessment. And these often or always include photographs, which are often useful if you're not that familiar with the site. And if you are familiar with it, it's worth looking at them to see what viewpoints they've chosen and whether you know of any better ones. Most technical reports will include summaries, so it's worth reading these even if you don't want to wade through all the detail. And importantly, it's also worth reading what other consultees and members of the public have said about the proposal. That will help you identify all the relevant issues and where you might get some support on particular issues and where you won't. As a consultee who often has limited local knowledge, I also read them to get clues about local characteristics and issues that I can't glean from maps and reports. So that detective work that I've just been talking about will probably have resulted in a wealth of information, but the key is how you pull that all together into an argument that will persuade the decision makers. The first hurdle is to get your representation noticed. On big applications, there may be hundreds of representations, and most of those, sadly, will only be skim read. So if your expertise is as a local resident, then try to make a joint submission with other residents so that issues are seen as community concerns rather than just private individual ones. If you have a relevant professional expertise yourself, or you've drawn on that of others, make sure it's obvious from the start of your representation so it carries more weight. The next thing to emphasise is that your representation is likely to be summarised rather than included in full in any report. So make it easy for the person doing that by summarising it yourself at the beginning of your letter. That way it will be more accurate and it's likely to stick more in readers' minds. Planning officers and committee members are very busy people, so if you can be short and to the point, that's better, even if you have to append more detailed evidence. So the development plan is the most important consideration with any application. And all decisions on planning applications must be made in accordance with it unless other material considerations indicate otherwise. That's the law. So the starting point should be how the proposal fits in with the current development plan. So all the information that you've gathered about the proposal, you need to look at how that fits in with the most relevant policies and how you can tie that information into that argument in terms of whether it complies with those policies or not. The other really important thing to remember is that you need to stick to the relevant issues, i.e. the issues that the decision maker, the local authority, can actually take into account. So for instance, if you're commenting on what's called a reserved matters application, which is an application that determines the design of a proposal where the principle of development has already been agreed at outline stage, any representation which says the development should not happen at all won't carry any weight because the council can't refuse permission on that basis. So try and stick to things that you think the council can actually use and can use to determine the application. Oh, skipped one. Yeah, so the last thing really is finding your allies. It's the people side of the argument. Find out by looking at that portal who is saying similar things to you. Can you work with those people? Can you work together to try and bolster those arguments? Follow up your written representation, and your council will tell you that all written representations are taken into account and given weight, but it's only human nature to pay more attention when people speak to us in person. Talk to your local councillor, take up opportunities to speak in front of committee, if necessary, even speak to the local press. So I'm not here to advise on how to run campaigns, but don't assume that writing representation letters is the end game, however comprehensive they are. And lastly, if you're likely to be commenting on planning proposals regularly, then take the time to build good relationships with those who will be making the decisions on them. In the long run, they're more likely to listen if you establish yourself as someone who's knowledgeable about their area, has a good understanding of the planning system, and importantly, treats people with respect even when you don't agree with them. Just on my last slide here, I've put down some useful sources which you can use, and understand that these will be circulated afterwards. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. And we now have some time for questions. We've got about 20 minutes, I think.
Hello, well, it's Claire Lloyd here. I've been monitoring some questions coming in, and my colleague Leslie may also have some questions. I have one that's just come in, and I'll read it straight away because it's a relatively long question. So from Janet, many districts in Sussex have local plans that have expired or are deemed to have done so. What advice does Claire have for those of us fighting large planning proposals, in my case, the Eton Welbeck Newtown in East Chilternton and Lewis, during the process of Lewis District coming up with their new plan?
I think probably the most important advice is to get to know your site really, really well and become the expert, if you like, in what the characteristics of that site is, what impact that development will have. Because what you will find is that there will be lots of so-called experts who will be submitting reports for that proposal, in your case, a local plan proposal. But for local people who know that site much better than any planning consultant or highway engineer that's writing their report probably remotely, then you can use that information to help inform that discussion and inform that decision.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I've only got two more at the moment. One of them is from another Claire or Phil, I'm not sure who. Do you recommend submitting photos with planning comments, for example, from Google Maps? Historically, we've only included written comments.
Yeah, I mean, photos can be really, really help to make your argument. And yeah, there's lots of ways now that you can embed photos within your letter rather than just appending them. So then they're helping to make that point. And often a point can get across much better visually than just by lots of words.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Another question from John. What if the local authority has no local plan?
Yeah, I mean, there's not too many local authorities that have no local plan at all, but there's lots that are considered out of date. So they still have to look at those local plans, even if they're not up to date in terms of their housing supply. Yet that's still the starting point. But you do need to bring in those site-specific characteristics as well. As I said in my presentation, you can't just rely on the fact that a site is outside of a development boundary, for instance, if that development boundary is in a plan that's 20 years old, because things will have moved on. Housing is ever increasing in terms of the requirements. So you need to justify your position in terms of the characteristics of that specific site, not just because of which side of a line it falls on a plan.
Okay, thank you. And of course, I've now got questions coming in thick and fast. So, and I think Leslie does as well. So the next one, I'll do them in order now. How do you deal with unexpected windfall sites that are not included in the neighbourhood development plan or the local plan?
How do we deal with them? Not sure what direction. I assume that's coming as a, if you're making representations about those sites. I mean, that's probably most of the sites that come forward at the moment, because most of our local plans are out of date. Most sites that come forward come into that category of unexpected windfall developments. And it is a question of trying to get as much information as you can about that site, because you won't be able to rely on information within a local plan or a neighbourhood plan or site assessments necessarily. But you can still find out if a site has been put forward as a proposed site in a local plan, for instance. It may be within what's called a SHLA, or a strategic housing land availability assessment. So there may be assessment material in that you can use, even if it hasn't got to a local plan stage.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I've got 13 now, 13, but I'm not sure about, I'll pass over to Leslie at some point. But Mary would like to know, let's have a look, if it's possible to have a training day on the following. The Environment Bill primary impact assessment on ecology. Their tool is biometric score, unusable when downloaded. Can we have a training day on it? Is that something you're able to answer now, or?
If you mean the biodiversity net gain proposals in the Environment Bill, then the local nature partnership did do a really good session on that recently, and I think they're hoping to put that on their website. So that's one resource to have a look at, because it is something that all of the local authorities are trying to get to grips with at the moment.
Thank you. Mary, did you get that? Oh, sorry. Mary,
can I just add in as well? We are looking for future training topics. So I have noted that down. And if anyone has other topics they want to put in the chat, because we will keep the chat, then do add them. Thanks.
Thank you. I can see Mary nodding, so I think that's okay for now. Okay. Leslie, do you want me to pass over to you and then come back to me again?
Okay, yes, Claire, thank you. I have a few that have come through to me. From Liz Hankins, she's saying, Claire, you gave an example of an application for 22 homes in the High Weald, but in the Low Weald, applications are being made for hundreds every time. How would your advice differ about being heard and influencing these large development proposals?
Yeah, I mean, the presentation I gave was for any proposal, whether it's in the High Weald or not. I mean, sadly, we are also getting proposals for hundreds of houses, even in the High Weald. That's the kind of world we're in at the moment. So you can use any of that advice in terms of any proposals coming forward in the Low Weald as well. Obviously, you're not in such a strong position because you don't have such strong national policies protecting undesignated landscapes. But you can still argue things like biodiversity, local characteristics, and landscape, whether it's a designated area or not.
Thank you. There's an environmental question actually here, Claire. It says from Doug Marriott, There is no comment about environmental compliance, e.g. Ashford, I think that's Borough Council, have a zero carbon commitment to be effective from 2030. How important is the utility design, solar, etc.? So,
yeah, it's a issue that we're wrestling with in our parish actually, because we've got a policy in our neighbourhood plan which asks for all developments to be zero carbon, and that's something that, you know, is an aspiration in our village, but we're really struggling to get any traction with in planning applications, because at the moment there isn't, the local planning authorities don't have the power to insist on that through the planning system. There are building regulations that are coming out which are gradually tightening up those standards, but they're a separate piece of legislation than planning. So it's a real, it's really difficult for people on the outside to understand how that works in a planning system. But definitely as things move on over the next few years, you should be seeing much better quality housing coming forward, and other buildings actually, in terms of their sustainability and their contribution to zero carbon.
I think there's time for one more question from me and one from the other Claire. Here's one that comes from the heart of CPRE actually. How do you, from David Sharp, how do you respond to applications that focus on the lack of a 5-year housing supply to justify building on the AONB and outside a development area?
Yeah, it's very tricky, because we've got national policy which says that major development should only happen in exceptional circumstances. But the exceptional circumstance which developers always quote is the very high housing numbers. I'm not going to call them need, because they're not what your average person would call need, but they are necessary. Yeah, they are the main plank of developers' argument as to why they should be able to develop those large sites in the AONB. And for the last couple of weeks, for instance, there's been an appeal going on the edge of Horsham for 473 homes in the AONB, where they were making precisely that argument. But you can still back against that in terms of the impact on the landscape and the impact of a specific proposal on the landscape, irrespective really of whether they win that in principle need argument.
Thank you. One more from Claire.
Hello there. I've got a note actually to say, I think we've got questions and answers till 10 to 5. Am I right? Or is that?
I believe so, yep.
Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Carry on, let's carry on.
That's okay, because I've actually now got 24 new questions.
Oh,
and I haven't had a chance to sort them all out, so I'll have a quick look through. But the first one's from Alison. Our town council have changed the build boundary to accommodate the proposed development, but I cannot find any documentation to support this change. Are they just allowed to do this?
If they're doing it through a neighbourhood plan, then yes, because a neighbourhood plan carries as much weight as a local plan. So moving development boundaries is one of the functions of a neighbourhood plan if it's trying to plan for further growth.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, just going back to where I was. We are threatened with 10,000 new homes on land west of Ifield and Crawley. Homes England, government Quango, are have unlimited access to public funds. Any advice on dealing with them?
I'm not sure they've got unlimited access to public funds, but certainly yes, they are. They've got. I think the biggest issue with Homes England actually is that they've got such a close relationship with local planning authorities, more so than normal developers. So it is an issue. I suppose the advantage is that when they do develop, they generally develop something that's better than average for developers, because they've got the control over the infrastructure, for instance. I think whether you're dealing with Homes England or a big private developer, it's a question of not getting overawed by the amount of technical information that's put in front of you. And say, just coming back to the fact that you are an expert in that site and that area and the general area in terms of what impact that development is going to have. And try and stick to things that are, if you like, outside the remit of the experts. So things like the impact on people, their perception of the landscape. You know, no expert from Reading or London can tell you what people's perception of the landscape is. Only local people can say that. So it's trying to keep on those grounds that aren't technical grounds, but they're about how you appreciate that site.
Thank you, Claire. And kind of off on a slight tangent to that, would you suggest that representations use planning language, or would the planning officer possibly take offence at this as they know the regulations better than most, i.e. what kind of language should people use in their representations?
I don't think planners would take offence at you using planning language. They probably wouldn't even notice because they think in that language, but don't feel that you have to use it either. It is, you know, it should be something that you can comment on using normal English or what's normal English to you, rather than feeling that you have to use the jargon.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to say about the importance and status of local plans that you haven't already touched on? Is there anything that people would find useful that we haven't touched on yet?
I mean, it's the importance of neighbourhood plans and local plans is about how up to date they are, really. So if you've got something that's very recently adopted, particularly a local plan, then you're on fairly strong ground in terms of something that goes against that plan. But even if you've got a plan that's 2 or 3 years old, if that local authority can't demonstrate that it's delivering the right amount of housing, then the influence of that plan starts to reduce. And that can also affect even recently approved neighbourhood plans. And that can be immensely frustrating if you've worked as a community to produce the neighbourhood plan, and then virtually as soon as it's made, are told it's out of date because your parent local authority hasn't got a housing supply. So it's trying to keeping up with that situation is quite hard for local communities, but it is worth keeping an eye on the housing supply situation in your area and how that might affect the weight that can be given to local plans and neighbourhood plans.
Thank you.
Claire, I've got 2 local plan and where to find information questions. So,
okay.
Catherine asks, where on the internet can the public view land submitted for the new local plan?
Submitted for the new local plan. Is that what you said? Sorry?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So all authorities will produce a piece of evidence that's either called a strategic land availability assessment or some variations of that theme. And basically developers and landowners will submit sites to that document, and they will assess those sites to see whether they are suitable for going into the local plan. So if you go onto your local authority website under planning policy and put in site assessments, that will come up with a list of those documents that you can look at.
Thank you. And the other one was relates to historical maps. Where would you find historical maps that would show old dew ponds? Relevant
the Library of Scotland is a really good site. So that will have maps going back to the earliest ones, which are sort of 1800, the Ordnance Survey draft. And it will have tithe maps, which are sort of 1840-ish. So that's as far as the comprehensive mapping of the country goes. For some areas, there might be estate maps which go back earlier, but that's not comprehensive coverage of the whole area.
Thank you. Any more from you, Claire?
They're still coming in thick and fast. I was scrolling down through them. Some of them are sort of requests for training. Some of them are requests for more information. I guess the overriding feeling from some people is that they don't know what to do really. They they can see that there's a lot of allocations for new housing, which they feel are leading to overdevelopment. But how can we actually go about questioning? What's the kind of route into questioning the plans and concerns and that kind of thing? What should Joe Public do?
Yeah, I mean, the routes really for local plans, there's formal consultation periods for those, and indeed for neighbourhood plans. In terms of the overall level of development, then that is a point that needs to be taken if you feel that the local authority is taking more development than it should do. Local authorities love to say that the housing numbers they get are targets. They're not targets. They're the starting point, that they then should look at where their constraints are as whether they can accommodate those numbers, and also the opportunities are to help out their neighbours if they are even more constrained. So it is something that always needs to be looked at, and it probably takes up the majority of the time at any local plan examination is the discussion over what the appropriate overall number is, which then sort of trickles down to, well, then how do you actually accommodate that within the area? But it's a significant issue for this area because the southeast in particular has housing numbers have absolutely ramped up in the last 10 years. And that's why we're getting all of these very, very big sites coming forward, including new settlements.
Thank you. We actually have a few more comments and questions about the Eton project. So I don't know if now's the right time to ask those. Oh, Kia wants to say something.
I'm really sorry, but we've still got a lot to cover. So we were going to have just a couple of minutes. Oh no, sorry, we've got till 10 to. Sorry, yeah, let's do some more on the Eton and then we'll have our break. Sorry.
Okay. One of the Eton ones is actually from somebody on the call who is the planning consultant working on the Eton project, and he lives locally, and he'd really love to work with local residents in order to gain the benefit of their knowledge. How would you advise him to overcome the understandable reluctance to do this when there is naturally local opposition?
Oh, that is a very interesting question.
Thanks, Andrew.
I think I'm going to go wider than Eton because it's all developers, particularly with major development sites, are supposed to have community consultation before they go forward with their proposals. And it is something that should, in an ideal world, work really well. But the practice of a lot of developers has been to carry out those in a rather tick box way. So I think there is a real challenge for anybody who genuinely wants to involve the community to actually overcome that distrust because of the amount of tick box type community consultation that has gone on for these sites. So I think it's really, and it sounds pretty obvious, it's really actually proving that you are going to listen to what they say and make changes as a result of what they say, that will be the challenge.
Thank you, Claire. There's lots more questions coming in, but I think we might have to get back to some of them afterwards. So we'll take a note of the questions. But one question here, are you able to, Claire, comment on the upcoming white paper and how neighbourhood plans may fit into this new potential legislation? Would CPRE or Claire recommend still pursuing neighbourhood plans with the current lack of certainty surrounding the future of such plans?
That's a really tricky question because there was very little said about neighbourhood plans in the white paper. And there's been a lot of conversation since about what the role might be. But really the only reference to neighbourhood plans in the white paper was about how they could help make local plans more informed by the community and how they could help in things like design. And there's been a bit of a kickback against that from those of us involved in neighbourhood plans, because neighbourhood plans at the moment do a lot more than just community consultation and design. Yes, those are important features of it, but they are genuinely at the moment trying to help people shape their communities. And we feel that should continue under the new planning system as well. Now, how that will work if you've got local authorities zoning areas, I think is quite tricky, because, you know, part of the way neighbourhood plans work is if they've got that freedom to say, well, the local plan hasn't allocated this site, but we think it's better and is a good site to allocate. And, you know, if the zoning is going to be so rigid that they're not able to do that, that is going to be an issue. So I think there is a lot of work going on behind the scenes to make sure that there is a role for neighbourhood planning in the new planning system, but we don't know what the results of that are yet.
Thank you, Claire. Just one final comment from me. There's a few questions and comments coming in about environmental factors, concerns about the environment, carbon emissions, other green issues, water quality. Have you got any general advice you can give to people that are particularly worried about environmental issues like those?
I think one of the things that we're trying to make as a point in our representations is there's somebody mentioned the Environment Bill. So at the same time as we've got planning legislation going through in this coming year, we've also got the poor old Environment Bill, which has been struggling through Parliament for the last few months and is still yet to make any progress. And the two things seem to be going on in separate silos. So you've got the Environment Bill proposing nature recovery networks, so that, you know, we can actually see a real increase in biodiversity rather than the decline that we have seen for the last 10 years. But at the same time, you've got a planning system which doesn't really have a role for those nature recovery networks within its development plan system. And my view is that those two things need to be planned together, because nature recovery networks aren't going to work if the development plan comes along and puts development in the very areas that they want to use for nature recovery. So the two things do need to be planned alongside each other.
Thank you, Claire. There are other questions, but we'll have to save those and come back to them. But thanks so much for all your answers so far.
You're welcome.
Can we take a 5-minute euphemistically called comfort break and leave your screens on, but we will resume in 5 minutes from now with a presentation from Phil Miles. Thank you all for your time. We are now going to resume the session with a talk from Phil Miles, and Phil is going to share with us his experience of successfully fighting off 2 planning appeals in his local village of Horsted Canes, and pass on some tips of what he has learned on what to do and what not to do. Phil?
Okay, hello. Just see if I can share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. Hello everyone. So my name's Phil Miles, and I'd like to share with you some of my experiences about supporting representations at the planning appeal stage. Firstly, a little bit about me. So I'm a local resident from the village of Horsted Canes, which is a village in mid-Sussex near Howards Heath. I would say that in our village, we've had more than our fair share of planning applications and appeals over the last 5 years. And as a direct result of that, even though I don't have any planning qualifications, I'm not an expert, I have gained a fair amount of experience of tackling what I would consider to be unwanted, inappropriate development on behalf of the community. And I'd like to share with you some of my experiences of that in hopes that some of it might be helpful to other people that are facing similar situations. So now just a little bit of a background to the village of Horsted Canes where I live. It's a medium-sized village, population's about 1,500 people, about 650 properties. It's set right in the heart of the Weald AONB. We have 2 conservation areas in the village, no less than 54 listed buildings. And that includes one St Giles Church, a grade one listed building, which is the origins of that date back to the Saxon times. The whole of the village is within the 7 kilometres zone of influence for the Ashdown Forest. We've also got SSI and 2 locally designated wildlife sites within the parish. And all the area around the settlement boundary of the village is designated as countryside area of development constraint. So one would have thought that with all those levels of protection, that developers would be looking elsewhere for their sites. But unfortunately, the one chink in our armour is that despite the best efforts of our parish council and various steering groups, we've so far not been able to make a neighbourhood development plan. And the result of that would become a target for developers on pretty much every field that surrounds our village. I'd just like to introduce you to one of the sites that I've spent a lot of time recently trying to protect. It's known in the community as the sledging field. It's a steeply sloping agricultural field. It's been used up until recently mainly for sheep grazing and an occasional seasonal hay crops. It's on the edge of the conservation area. It's adjacent to a number of listed buildings and within the setting of the St Giles Church that I mentioned previously. Importantly, the field itself forms a strategic gap between the Saxon settlement area around the church and the later developed settlement areas of the village. The first application that we faced from the developers was for 38 houses. And following a huge amount of objection from the community, this application was refused by Mid Sussex District Council, mainly on the grounds of the impact that it would have had on the area of outstanding natural beauty and also on the heritage assets, the conservation area and the listed buildings. But undeterred by that, the developer then appealed that decision. But just before the inquiry was due to take place, the developer withdrew from the appeal. And I'll come on to explain the reasons for that later. At the same time of withdrawing from the appeal, the developer then put in a second application for 9 large houses on the same site. Mid Sussex District Council then refused that second application on the similar grounds for the first one. Again, the developer appealed that decision, and after a hearing that took place earlier this year in January, after a 6-month delay because of COVID, the inspector then dismissed that appeal. So just like to run through some of the procedural issues around appeals. That for most people starts with a notification, and that's given by the local planning authority. If you've made a representation at the application stage, then you would normally receive a notification about the appeal. But another good way of making sure that you receive a notification, because you obviously don't want to miss that, is to register with the local planning authority to receive automated online notifications every time an application or an appeal comes up in your area. There are 3 basic types of procedure that appeals take, and the type depends basically on the size and complexity of the project, and also on the level of public interest. The most simple one is a written representation. Here, each party submits their evidence and statements to the inspector, who considers them all and then issues his decision. Fairly straightforward. The next one up is a hearing. This is where the evidence is examined by the inspector on a round table type discussion. It's a fairly formal process, but not as formal as the inquiry, where all the evidence is examined and is cross-examined, and they can take several days. One topic can take at least a day. There are various procedure guides issued by the Planning Inspectorate, and these are well worth reading because they contain an awful lot of good information on how the process will take place. If you want to be represented at an appeal, there are two basic methods that you can adopt. The first is an interested party. That's the most simple method. But the best method of taking an active part would be to register as a Rule 6 party. This is like having a seat at the top table with the planning inspector and the appellant and the authority. And you get to cross-examine the appellants It's not absolutely necessary to be legally represented if you're a Rule 6 party, but I would say it's strongly recommended. When we took part as a Rule 6 party for the first sledging field appeal, we employed a junior barrister, and we also had a number of expert witnesses to provide evidence. If you do want to be represented, it's very important to register first with PINS and very quickly if you want to be a Rule 6 party. You have to apply to have Rule 6 party status. And in making your application, you're advised to set out what it is that you'll bring to the inquiry. This could be something as straightforward as representing the views of the community, or you may wish to set out that you're going to bring some specific evidence. On the inquiry that I took part in for the sledging field, not only were we supporting all the planning authorities' reasons for refusal, but we also chose to challenge the appellants on their highway access, even though that wasn't one of the reasons for refusal. And it was actually the strength of the evidence that we were bringing to the inquiry that led the appellant to withdraw from the appeal. So it does go to show that you really can make a difference as a community group. I also say that a lot of the evidence we brought to the appeal by our landscape consultants and our heritage consultants was used by the authority in their case. Local authorities are often very strapped for cash. They're bombarded with appeals left, right and centre. So they can't always afford to employ their own professional expert witnesses. So they can feed off the information that's provided by third parties. Just running through the programme. At the start of the process, the Planning Inspectorate sets out a timetable. And it's good to be aware that the dates on the timetable are deadlines, they're not just targets. Unlike in the planning application stage where dates tend to drift, that's not my experience in the world of appeals. Normally a date has to be met. The first documents that are produced are the statements of case from each of the parties. These can be relatively short documents, but they're very important because you have to get all of your arguments into that first statement of case. Evidence is provided later to back up the statement that you've made, but you're not allowed to introduce new points later on once your statement of case is issued. A date's then set for interested parties to make their representations, and at a later point, the statement of common ground is prepared between the local authority and the appellant. This shows where there are items of agreement and there's still items in dispute. And it helps to narrow down the field of what the inspector needs to look at. As a Rule 6 party, you can have an input into that statement of common ground. Then just shortly before the inquiry date, the proofs of evidence are prepared by the experts, and these are all exchanged on one day before the inquiry. Inquiry dates fixed by the Planning Inspectorate, but each party has one opportunity to reject a date. Having rejected one date, they can then have a date forced upon them by the Inspectorate, however inconvenient that might be, and that's happened to us. Just moving to the day itself, or the start of the event. Like most things recently, all the ones that we've taken part in happened virtually. The planning inspectorate used Microsoft Teams, which operates very similar to Zoom. There are a few subtle differences, so it's as well to have a practice on that and make sure you're familiar with it. The joining instructions are issued by the planning inspectorate, and there's an opportunity to join a test hearing before the event to make sure everything works okay. There's also a short video that the planning inspectorates have done to explain what you can expect on the day. Communicating during the day, bearing in mind if it is happening virtually, your team will probably be dotted at all different parts away. So it's good to have a method where you can communicate with each other outside of Teams, because you're not allowed to use the private chat function of Teams. So we found WhatsApp was a very good way of communicating within our team. If you're not going to be professionally represented, but you still want to speak at a hearing or an inquiry, then you can make a statement. You need to join at the beginning of the event and let the inspector know that you want to speak, and he or she will allocate a time, normally at the start of the hearing. If you want to take a more active part than just making a statement, that can also be done. Again, let the inspector know at the beginning. I did this recently on another inquiry where we weren't being professionally represented, but the inspector allowed me to comment or to speak after each part of the main evidence had been examined. In my naivety, I thought I was going to be able to pass comment on the evidence that I just heard, but the inspector quickly pointed out to me that that wasn't allowed. I had to raise questions. So you have to raise a question to try and get the answer that you want, and that can be tricky. It's one of the reasons why it's best to always be represented if you can afford to do that. There's obviously lots of documents involved in an inquiry, far too many to print off. So I found it handy to have two screens running, one with Microsoft Teams on and the other with the inquiry documents, so that you could keep on top of everything. What lessons have we learnt? Well, I would definitely say it's worth getting ahead of the game and not waiting for the appeal to actually land. If you know that an application's been refused, you might as well assume that it's going to be appealed. Developers normally do, often do. So you might as well start by working out how you'll fight it. It can be a daunting prospect if you're trying to do this by yourself, so I definitely recommend setting up a community group and working together. We worked as a group of 3 people. We found that a good number. If you get too many people, you'll just get a lot of different opinions and not a lot of action, but a small group of people that are prepared to get stuck in is probably best. Even with 3, we didn't always agree. Start by setting out your strategy. How will you be represented? Do you want to employ professionals? Which professionals would you employ? It's as well to work out what your strongest points are, because the chances are you won't have enough funds to fight on all the various topics. So it's best to pick 1 or 2 of your strongest points and do them really well, rather than the scattergun approach. Make contact with consultants early on and get some quotes so that when the appeal lands, you're in a good position to make appointments quickly, because time will soon fly past. Brings me on to funding. It's always good to set a budget so that you've got a target that you can share with the community and everyone knows how much money you're trying to raise. I'd also recommend setting up a bank account very early on, because these things take a lot of time, especially if you want to have joint signatures on an account. Publicity, different methods work for different people. So if you can use as many different methods of publicising as possible, we set up a website, and we used one that allows people to subscribe to receive email updates. We found that a very good way of keeping in touch with people and getting them to take action when we needed them to. We also set up our own Facebook page, and posts that we put on that were reposted on the Village Gossip Facebook page. It's a very good way of reaching a lot of people very quickly. We also had some professionally printed leaflets on good quality paper with good photographs, which we distributed around the whole of the village, and we put up posters all around the village as well. The other thing we did was get 3 very large banners printed, like the one at the bottom in the image at the bottom of the screen, this slide. They were really effective. We didn't leave them up all the time, but we just put them up when we needed people to take action, and they were very, very effective. They really annoyed the developer as well, because to the point that he was seen trying to remove them from, even though they were on private land. We also arranged for an event where we got over 100 people from the local residents together to form a photo shoot, all lined up along the footpath at the bottom of our site, and managed to get front page spread on the Mid Sussex District Times. And coincidentally, that went to print on the same day that we went to see our local MP, Sir Nicholas Soames, who commented that we were on the front page of his newspaper. But he was very supportive, and he wrote to the local authority in support of the community in their objection to the development. It all helps to raise the profile and energise the community into taking action. We issued targeted letters to all the people that were directly impacted by the developments, and we found that the most effective way, and by far the amount of money, was raised by writing personally addressed letters to our neighbours. We also used a crowdfunding platform to crowdfund from the wider community, which was also very good. The crowdfunder one is similar to the Just Giving, and we found the fees were a bit less. And there was also a good way of keeping in touch with people through the crowdfunder platform. So very much like with publicity, it's offering people a number of different ways of contributing. The other thing I would say is it's always good to give people a suggested level of donation rather than just asking for donations, because people often don't know what sort of level of money you're looking for. So in addition to making professional representations, it's always good to get responses from all different parts of the community as you can, particularly the parish council. It's an obvious one, but very important. The other one we used was the school, if it's relevant. It was for us because the access to the site was off of a narrow lane where all 100+ primary school children walk to school without any footpaths, and the parents, teachers and governors were very concerned about the children's safety. We also encouraged as many local residents to write in response to the appeal as possible. We encouraged people to do that in their own words, not just copying and pasting what we'd said or what other people have said. We also encouraged them to say something new, because the planning inspector will receive copies of all the representations that are made at the application stage anyway. So it's best not to just repeat what people have said previously, but to try and come up with something new and short. As was mentioned earlier, photographs are a really good way of getting your point across. I definitely recommend doing that. And I put here also keeping it simple for people. You probably find that a lot of people will only engage if you make it super easy for them. So we emailed a link to the planning inspectorate's appeal register, and with some simple step-by-step instructions on how to make a very short, simple statement. Cost recovery, well, don't expect to get your money back if you win. This is very, very rare. It's the normal position is that the parties bear their own costs. You have to demonstrate something called unreasonable behaviour on the part of the party you're trying to recover costs from. We were successful in doing that. We claimed that the appellant acted unreasonably in the first appeal by withdrawing just at the last minute after we'd spent a lot of money preparing evidence. The Secretary of State agreed with us, and he issued an award of costs against the developer, against the appellant. Hooray, we thought, but there was a catch. They didn't say how much the developer should pay, and we were left to try and negotiate with the developer. Well, there was fat chance of that happening. We just caused him to withdraw from the appeal, so there was no way he was going to cooperate with us. We then had to get the award of costs made an order of the High Court, and then we had to get a cost consultant to prepare a bill of costs to set out in a format that was recognised by the courts, and then apply to the senior courts office for a default cost certificate before we finally paid up. But in the end, we got our money. So for us so far, this has been a happy ending. We had 2 applications refused by the local authority, 1 appeal withdrawn, and a 2nd appeal dismissed by an inspector. And we got some of our money back as well. But we know that's not necessarily the end. We know the developer's not going to give up. We know he's already thinking about what he's going to do next. So the only option we think we've got to try and save the site for sure is to make a bid for it. And that's what we're trying to do at the moment. Thank you. I think we've got time for some questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That was very clear, very encouraging, I would hope, to many that there is some power in people after all, and very open to questions either on Phil's presentation or further. We've got until quarter to 6 for questions and discussion.
Well, I have some questions for you. This is Claire. If it's okay to go ahead now.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if Leslie has any too, but I'll start off. Actually, a couple of people did ask if it's all right for you to share how much money you had to spend on this, your budget, or whether that's kind of sensitive information.
No, we can share something on that. Obviously, we used our consultants to make representations at the application stage. So all of our consultants were already familiar with the site. So the fees that we budgeted for were probably a little bit less than if a consultant's coming in and doesn't know anything about the site. And the other situation we had, it because one appeal was withdrawn, they didn't, although they'd prepared a lot of the evidence, they didn't go through with the actual inquiry date itself on the first appeal. But what I can tell you is when we set out for the main appeal, we had a budget of around 30,000, and we were hoping that that would cover the cost of employing a junior barrister and about 3 expert witnesses. And that was having spent probably about 8,000 at the application stage. In the end, we didn't spend all of that, and we got some of it back, and then we spent another 10 or whatever in the second appeal.
Thanks very much, Phil. A question from the beginning of your presentation, actually. When you mentioned PIN, P-I-N, what does that stand for?
Planning Inspectorate, sorry.
Oh, okay, thank you. One of the councillors on our call has asked whether it's possible to have the application numbers for the sledging field.
Yes, can I share those through Leslie later?
Yes.
Thank you. That's brilliant. I'm just scrolling down because a few more questions have come in. As we said earlier, we're going to share the slides and the presentation. So I know some of you want links to various things which are in Claire Tester's presentation at the beginning. Let me just see. What another councillor has asked, what size of community fighting fund would you say is realistic, or did you find that was realistic for you?
It worked for us. I say initially, when we were just fighting the application, we set a budget of around 8,000, and we were within a few £100 of that is what we actually raised, and we did spend. So that worked at application stage, and yeah, budget for the appeal was around 30,000. It seemed realistic. It all depends how many professionals you want to use. If we were short, we probably would have only used two professional expert witnesses rather than the 3 that we were hoping to use.
Thank you. And another question for you, Phil, from Alan. How did you engage with the parish council and what was their role or contribution?
Yes, we did work with the parish council. We encouraged them to make their own submission, but we were seen as being separate to the parish council. It was a little bit difficult because the chairman of the parish council lived in one of the roads that led to the site, so he felt he was a bit conflicted, so it was difficult, but the parish council was still able to make a representation and support us in that way, but they didn't actually fund us directly.
Thank you, Phil. Are you able to talk a little bit more about how a Rule 6 party can most constructively engage with the planning authority at appeal stage that refuse the planning permission?
Yeah, this is interesting because we work very closely with the planning authority to the point that our barrister was from the same chambers as the local authorities barrister, QC, that they were employing. We actually had a joint meeting with us and our barrister and their barrister and in chambers to agree what points so that we each knew what points we would all be raising, and we weren't cutting across each other or duplicating effort, and we were supporting each other. So we worked really well in that respect. We also had a meeting prior to that in the local authorities offices as well.
Thank you. I'm just going to give you a break from my voice because Leslie has a couple of questions as well.
Yes, one from David Sharp, who asks, if you had lost the appeal, would you have gone to judicial review, and what budget would you allow for that?
Probably not. I gather it's really, really expensive to do that. You're probably talking, literally tens of thousands of pounds. Fortunately, we didn't have to contemplate that situation, but you've got to have very strong grounds to be doing that.
Thank you. There's a question actually for Claire Tester. Claire, if you can reappear. This is from Catherine and asks, would you recommend neighbourhood development plans, because doesn't this mean that some local land must be found somewhere, and this could prove to be divisive? Can a neighbourhood development plan refuse to provide land to the local authority?
Okay, well, neighbourhood plans are voluntary to start with, so a parish doesn't have to produce a neighbourhood plan, and it is up to the neighbourhood plan group what the scope of their plan is. So they can seek to allocate sites, and a lot of neighbourhood plans have gone down that route because they wanted to have sort of control over which sites were selected and which weren't. But that has to be in compliance with the overarching local plan. So if the local plan says that your parish has to provide 50 houses, then you need to find sites for 50 houses. a lot of neighbourhood plans have found that really hard, because it's in some ways, it's although you know your area better and therefore can hopefully plan for it better, you're also much closer to those who aren't going to be very happy with those sites. So, you know, some neighbourhood plans, and you know, Horsley Canes is probably one of those, have really struggled with that particular aspect of neighbourhood planning, because you will get half of the village in favour of one site or against one site, and you know, you get village wars effectively. So it is up to each neighbourhood planning group what the scope of their plan is, and how far they want to go down that route.
Thank you. And going back to an earlier question, again, it's for you, Claire, and it's asked from Susan Green, who says, it seems that developers are rushing in multiple applications for 3 reasons: because local plans are not in place, to act before enforcement of the new Environment Bill, and the government's policy to focus on building in the north hasn't been brought in. Is there anything that can be done to prevent this rush? Big question.
I don't think you can control what applications developers submit. Local authorities have to determine, you know, what is submitted to them, and there is a sort of an interim phase at the moment where we have got a lot of local authorities who haven't got those neighbourhood plans in, those local plans in place, and part of the reason for that is again the housing pressure, in that a lot of local plans have got stuck in this duty to cooperate trap of whether they can or can't take their neighbours' needs as well as their own, and have, you know, got as far as the examination stage and then had to take a step backwards. There's very much a snakes and ladders game going on at the moment. So yeah, it is a problem, and I absolutely understand where communities are coming from in terms of it does feel like you're under siege at the moment, but you know, we do have to deal with everything as it comes forward. You can't stop the applications coming forward.
Thank you. And there's just a point of clarification, I think, from Marie-Louise Neal, that she's just saying it's basically the public can't appeal a planning decision, can they? They can't fight planning approval that's been given. There's no right.
So if a local authority is granted planning permission, there's no right of appeal by a third party. There's only a right of appeal if, for the applicant, if the planning authority refuse it, or they can appeal against conditions as well.
Thank you. That's all the questions that I have at the moment. Don't know if Claire has any more.
I do. I have a few coming in still. I think this one's really for Phil. At what stage did you employ your experts? Was one a planning expert or specific to particular issues on the site?
Yeah, we did employ a planning expert when we fought the first application, but when we came to the and we had a landscape consultant and a highways consultant for the first application. Then when we came to the appeal, we decided that we would employ a junior barrister, and he said our landscape evidence was very good, but he'd identified a hole in that we hadn't done anything on heritage. So we then employed a heritage witness and a landscape consultant, and we produced a small amount of evidence also on the highways section as well.
Thank you very much. I've got quite an interesting question here about crowdfunding. If you hadn't spent all the money, would you have had to refund your crowdfunding sources? I don't know if anyone's.
We did state at the beginning that we would repay proportionally what was left over, yes.
Okay. Somebody has a question from Claire's presentation. Can I please re-ask about the roof orientation from the first presentation? I'm not
Um,
sure.
I understand the question.
Yeah, sorry, that's come from Doug. He's said it's about sort of environmental issues, and he's put I'm just going to the top of it. Oh, I'm gonna have to go halfway through, and Doug, you might have to unmute yourself and jump in. He's put a roof orientation is critical. What methodology should be used to influence orientation, given that a house owner, after initial sale, may wish to install PV? If the orientation is unsuitable, it effectively precludes the use of PV. So I think this is more about you know, how to get better standards for sustainability for housing.
Correct. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really comment on the right methodology to use for that, because that's a very specialist question. But I think generally the sort of orientation of houses is one area where the planning system can influence how sustainable a development is, because obviously it influences or it approves the layout of a development. I think the difficult area in terms of sustainability measures is where it's talking about the fabric of the building, and where that boundary is between what you can influence through planning and what you can influence through building regulations. So yes, certainly the orientation of buildings is very important consideration at the layout stage.
Could I make a point? That if you talk to the planning authority, they're completely blind with this. They have no idea what one is talking about. And if you have a house orientation 20 degrees out, the efficiency of your PV system drops dramatically to something less than 60% efficient. So if you buy the house with the wrong roof, you'll never ever be able to put a PV system onto it with a sensible payback. And we're all driving towards this zero carbon policy, but you cannot make any impact whatsoever with any of the planners or the developers or any of the stakeholders.
Can I say something there, and then you can go on to the next one. I hope this answers your question, Doug, but I think one of the key stages where as a community we can get more traction there is as local plans are reviewed and policies are reviewed. So for example, the South Downs National Park, in their local plan, they have some really interesting work there around how to, you know, what they're looking for in terms of low carbon buildings. And unfortunately, a lot of the other local plans are not pushing for standards as high as the national park. I mean, overall, the national park is able to have a very sort of landscape-led, more sustainable, I suppose, local plan than the other local authorities. But I mean, we are hoping that more local authorities now are going to start aiming higher towards what the national park's requiring. So I suppose if you're involved in a local plan review, that's definitely something you could push forward, and it's something that we'll take note of as well. Thank you. Sorry, Claire, I'll go back to you for more questions.
Okay, another one for Claire. In fighting a scheme that would affect open countryside, what is our biggest weapon, would you say? Ecological, lack of infrastructure? What carries most weight in your experience?
I think one of the challenges that communities have is where they're up against technical experts. So if you try and argue an ecological argument and you've got the developer fielding a qualified ecologist, it's hard to convince either local planning authority or the inspector at appeal that what you're saying about ecology is more right than the developer's expert. So I would always suggest that you stay on terrain where, as I said earlier, you are the expert. So in terms of the character of the area, what makes it special to the people who live around it, rather than getting too stuck into technical areas like ecology, transport, things like that, where you're always going to be on the back foot.
Thank you. And actually related to that, there's another question. If you want an independent assessment of the ecological aspects of the site, can the developer actually refuse that?
He can refuse you access to the land, and it's really difficult to carry out a proper ecological survey if you can't get your ecologist to get on the land. That's the issue.
Okay.
I'm sorry, can I just add to that? There may be situations though where there are public rights of way through a site. And if you're on a public right of way, then you have every right to be there.
Thank you. And what would happen if your local authority do not oppose the developer on the grounds of being held to account by government?
Sorry, was that aimed at me? Well,
I haven't specified you, but
okay.
I'm guessing.
Well, essentially in that situation, the local authority is likely to approve the application. So it's about, say, getting involved with your local councillors before that decision's made.
Sorry about that, I had a bit of interference then on the line. So I'm just seeing if there's any other questions which for Phil or Claire. Do you have any more, Leslie?
There's one that probably Kia might answer because it's about government policy, or Claire, of course. It seems that planning needs to change from the top down. Can we influence government policy? Surely they need to pause to reassess need and road usage since the pandemic, and especially with so many now working from home.
Maybe if I start and Claire, you can add. Yes, you definitely can influence national policy, and that's really what our MPs are there to help us with. Many of our Sussex MPs, some of the Sussex MPs do get involved in planning applications, and for example, they might help if there's a referral to the Secretary of State, or there are things they can definitely do in terms of local planning, but they also have a big role in terms of the national policies and the framework that we're working towards. And there is a big plan at the moment for planning reform. There was a white paper last year, and linked to that were plans for changing how we decide how many homes should be built in areas. The initial plan was called by many the mutant algorithm, and I have to say that the MPs did a really great job of collaborating to get that plan. Well, it hasn't come to fruition. The problem is that there are still problems with the current planning system, and there are still concerns that CPRE and others have about planning reform. So we are constantly feeding these to our local MPs. CPRE, we have obviously a local CPRE, which is us, a very, very small charity, but there is a national team that we link to, and they have a political arm. So they are constantly working with government to try and highlight problems. So where it can be really effective, I think, is where you have a local example to illustrate a flaw in national policy. I think that can be quite powerful. So it's really helpful to get lots of feedback from people about where the planning system is working really well and where we have problems. So, for example, recently, CPRE Sussex and the Sussex Wildlife Trust wrote a joint letter to all the MPs in Sussex about out-of-date local plans and the problem that is causing, because nearly all the local authorities in Sussex, or the planning authorities, have an out-of-date plan for one reason or another, and it is not helping local communities. It's giving them worse outcomes. So yes, write to your MP if you are worried about something, and if they get a lot of letters, then that gives them more impetus to act for you. Claire, do you want to add to that?
No, not really. You've said everything in that. It is something that we can work better together on. So we work through the National Association of AONBs, just as CPRE works through the National CPRE office. Because that just gives you a bigger voice in those discussions.
And often where we're getting decisions that are very unpopular with a lot of local people, it's because there is a problem with national policy or a flaw or something that needs to be tightened up as well. And the more we can do to highlight that, the better. I've got a question myself from Jill Sutcliffe. Jill, again, it's a tricky one, so I will try and put it to Claire, but you might have to unmute yourself if you feel I have not explained it properly. So the question is, our neighbouring plan is about to go to Regulation 14. Southern Water have brought up the issue of the North Sussex water zone. It's dependent on the view of Natural England. So given the AON and SPA, this might affect future water supply. So I think the question is saying about how do we work best with Southern Water and Natural England? Would that be a fair summary?
I think it's part of it. The issues, it's suddenly come up just as the neighbourhood plan was going to consultation. Of course, has involved a hell of a lot of work, and it looks like it might be a showstopper. So we're waiting to hear back. For our neighbouring parish, Loxwood, they consider it a showstopper. They've suspended their neighbourhood plan, and they think there'll be no applications approved for housing in Loxwood because the water supply to extra population, but also the Upper Arun is a special conservation site for its aquatic invertebrates. So any impacts on the water may affect a European site. Is that clearer?
Okay. I mean, I can't answer the specific inquiry because I don't know enough about that particular issue. I mean, in general, if you get big strategic consultees like that sort of weighing in on the neighbourhood plan process, it's really important that you involve your local planning authority because, you know, it's a much bigger issue than one parish, that sort of thing. I've had experience of where the Highways Agency, for instance, has weighed in on a neighbourhood plan, and you really can't tackle that on your own. You have to get the support of the local planning authority to get a more strategic approach to it and get them to listen. Because, yeah, it could be that stops a neighbourhood plan, but it doesn't stop planning applications. So you've then lost that control over where development's going.
That's a fair point. We've also got European protected species of bats, which haven't been properly taken into account. So we've got a pincer movement on the applications themselves.
Thank you. Claire, have you got any more questions?
I have quite a few, and I'm feeling a little bit bad that I haven't managed to get to everyone. But I think Councillor Murphy wanted to ask one final question. I'm scrolling through to try and find it. I don't know if Councillor Murphy's happy to ask live and direct. Is he there?
Yes, sorry. So my question is about the time scales for responding to planning applications. So what we found with our planning authority is that they have changed their method of advertising and they actually put up the site notices themselves. So we find as a parish council sometimes that we have a date that they've given us that then is very shortly after they've put the notices up. And sometimes, particularly if it's for us, a large development, we want that real micro local knowledge that we might not even have, you know, from immediate neighbours, etc. We're being told that we still have to comply with the date given unless we've requested an extension. Is that correct? Because if it's a consultation that's still open to the public, why would we have to reply at an earlier date?
Okay, that is quite surprising. I mean, as a parish, we quite often go back to the district council and say, look, we can't meet that deadline because it doesn't fit with our meeting schedule or for whatever reason. And you're usually quite relaxed about that as long as it doesn't go beyond the consultation date, for instance, as you say, for the site notice or for any other advertisement of the application. Because they can't release the decision until all of those expiry dates are passed.
I mean, sorry.
No, carry on.
I was just going to say they have been known to give us extensions. I can only think of one example when it's failed, but I thought we could automatically assume if they move that date on their website for the consultation that we could, you know, delay our reply without even going back to them. And also when it's, I mean, we're a parish, we don't have that many big applications compared to some other places, but even like if it's 20 homes, that's quite big for us. and we want to know what people think about it.
Yeah, I think you need to make the request rather than just assume that you can go back. But yeah, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't grant that request.
Okay, and sorry, I did have another question as well, if that's all right. What is the difference between a permission in principle application and an outline planning application?
Ooh. Thanks for that one. So permission in principle is quite a new process, and it's similar to an outline application, but with even less information. So literally all the applicant has to do is put in a red line around a site and say, give some parameters for what development they want to put on that. So a recent one that I was consulted on had a line around the site and said, we want to put between 3 and 5 dwellings on this site. So you don't get any of the reports that you would normally expect to back an outline application. It's literally just the principle of that proposal.
Yeah. Okay, so it's less information basically. I'm just wondering why. I mean, we've only had one as a parish council, which was just for one dwelling. I'm just wondering why developers would not go down that route more, because it's a lot cheaper for them. And I would have thought once you've passed that hurdle, you know, then the next set of hurdles falls more easily.
Yeah, I think it's just because it is relatively new, and developers do tend to be quite risk averse with things that they haven't done before.
Okay, and the third thing, which isn't a question, but people might find it helpful. People were asking about Sheila sites, and yes, you should be able to find maps. But what I've requested in the past, which I had to do under I think it's the EIA rather than the FOI, was to request the actual forms, which they didn't want to let me have, but had to in the end because it did comply with the requirements. And then you can see how many dwellings are proposed on that site, when they plan to build them out, all that information, which is really useful. So if you want that, request it from your planning authority, because they will have to give it to you.
Thank you so much, Councillor Murphy. I have just copied all the questions that have come up today because we haven't answered them all. I'm really sorry if they're your questions, but we will have a look through and come back to you. Thanks, Michael.
Can I just say we will try and help as many people as we can, but we are a very small charity. So if we are unable to answer all your questions, I'm really sorry, but we will do our best. We'll try and put maybe some answers on the website along with the slides following the event so that you can access them.
Well, thank you, everybody. We're going to honour our promise to bring this session to a timely close. I think we need to end the questions here. So can I thank our two speakers and my CPRE Sussex colleagues who've organised the event on your behalf. But most of all, I want to thank you for participating in this afternoon's event and for your questions. It has been our most popular to date, and for that I'm very grateful. CPRE Sussex has been running training events for over 7 years now on a variety of planning subjects that crop up regularly. Sustainability, biodiversity, good design, landscape character, all spring to mind as topics that we've covered over the years. Originally, our target was our own planning volunteers. None of us has a professional planning background, so we're all self-taught on the job to ensure that we have shared our knowledge and our ideas amongst ourselves. As time has gone on, we've expanded our horizons, occasionally brought in outside speakers, and we've encouraged our own members and members of local parish councils to join in our training sessions and workshops. And they've all been well attended and very well received. Today is the first full flowering of a training session that's open to everyone. So courtesy of COVID and Zoom, its format has been online, as you know, and rather more lecture-ish than hitherto, but we do hope it's been useful. We will be circulating a feedback questionnaire, and we would like to hear back from you on how we can make this all work still better, and for topics that you would like us to organise in the future. As the whole problem of the new planning regime that we're going to be faced with, where notices on of planning developments on telegraph poles and things is all going to disappear, and it's all going to be grand and online and in 3D. And we're all going to have to be technological wizards. There's the Environment Bill, which I know concerns many of us. The whole question of climate change. And we're in a world where the government has committed itself to reduce our carbon footprint by 78% by 2035, where we have many local plans that run into the 2030s, and very, very few local plans nationally have any coherent climate change policy at all as to how we're going to achieve that reduction. It's a big current issue. So it's something we're going to have to pick up and fight harder on in the months ahead to make sure that as local plans are revised and updated, there is a proper climate change policy within them, because most of them are lacking. And we will be making a recording of today's event to share with colleagues. Last but not least, there's a rumor that one or two of you may not have signed up yet as CPRE members. CPRE works hard for our countryside and our rural communities. We are confident that we punch well above our weight at both national and public level. We do it with inadequate money and too few active volunteers. So as a member-owned charity, we really do urge everyone listening today to join our CPRE community and to become a CPRE member if you aren't already, and share the benefits of membership. You can find out what those benefits are and join easily online through your local CPRE branch or through our national office website. And your support will strengthen our hand, as well as giving you some benefits as a member. So thank you all, and stay safe.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
A big thank you as well to Claire, Michael and Phil for bringing their time to this. We really appreciate that. And thank you to Leslie and Claire for seamless organisation and running of the session. And thank everyone. Thank you all so much for coming along. I hope it's been useful and it will help you in shaping the places that you love. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.